Welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be about America finally joining World War II. So Pearl Harbor has happened. America has officially declared war on Japan. Hitler does FDR a gigantic political favor by declaring war on the United States. So it makes it politically very easy for FDR to then in turn declare war on Germany. Now, FDR has a decision to make. We've got two enemies, and there's a different ocean separating us from each one of those two enemies. So there's, the Atlantic Ocean. On the other side of that, there's Adolf Hitler, and then there's the Pacific Ocean, and on the other side of that is Japan. And so, we're going to have to essentially fight a war on two fronts here. But FDR knows he needs to, because both of those enemies are, significant enemies. He knows he's going to have to focus on one over the other. Well, he's going to come to the conclusion that he does need to focus on Germany and the war in Europe first, and then once that war is over, turn his attention to Japan and dealing with the Japanese in the Pacific. Now, he does that very specifically because the British might not be able to last much longer. The British and the Soviets might not be able to last much longer without American help. So Joseph Stalin in particular is screaming for help. The Soviets are bearing the absolute brunt of the war in Europe. And so FDR will decide to focus on, the war in Europe first. But because Japan attacked us at Pearl Harbor, right now America essentially looks like a bunch of punks, right? We got sucker punched. There's, probably no better way to describe the attack on Pearl Harbor than a sucker punch. We were negotiating with the Japanese when they attacked us. And, anytime you get sucker punched, you've got to, somehow be able to assert yourself. And so, FDR wants to be able to do something to, punch back, to show the Japanese that, yes, you hit us. It wasn't as devastating as you thought it was, because we are going to be able to counterpunch you. It is coming. And, we are, and, it's a show of strength, essentially. It's showing that America's not weak. And so what the answer to that is, what the counterpunch is going to be Doolittle's raid. So Doolittle is going to come up with a plan to essentially punch Japan back. And, this is actually an ingenious and incredibly daring plan. He's going to use B-52 bombers to try and attack the heart of Japan, Tokyo itself. Now, this is like absolutely, just a shocking plan, because B-52s, Japan is so far away. B-52s don't have the range to be able to get to Japan to attack Japan directly. And we don't have any functioning military bases at this point, close enough to attack Japan. The Japanese didn't just attack the United States at Pearl Harbor. They also attacked us at the Philippines. And so the Philippines is a hot mess right now. The Japanese are expanding there. They're expanding in Burma. We don't really have anything close enough to get the B-52s in range, except aircraft carriers. Now, what makes Doolittle's raid so absolutely amazing is that he figures out a way to get B-52s to be able to take off on aircraft carriers. And so, B-52s, typically need a takeoff speed of about 100 miles an hour, which means they need 800 feet of runway to be able to take off. Well, you're not going to get that with an aircraft carrier, not anywhere close. And so he's got to figure out a way, Doolittle, if he's going to make this raid necessary. He's got to figure out a way to get these B-52s to be able to launch off of an aircraft carrier. And so what he does is he gets an all voluntary group of pilots, right, to together to try and figure this out. And he goes out into an air base out in the desert, and essentially, walks out the roughly 300 so feet, I don't know the number exactly, of runway space that these B-52s are going to be able to have to take off. And he's going to start to figure out ways to essentially slingshot these planes to get them to that 100-mile-per-hour speed as quickly as possible, to get them to take off before they would end up, just driving right off the end of an aircraft carrier. He's also going to try and figure out how to make the planes lighter. And he's essentially going to strip these B-52s of any unnecessary weight. And I really do mean any unnecessary weight. He's going to take off all of the armor on these things. And so these planes are essentially going to be just defenseless as they fly over enemy territory. The B-52s, once they do figure out how to take off of an aircraft carrier, they're definitely going to outrange any kind of support fighter planes that they would potentially have. And so taking off their armor is no joke. They're going to take off just absolutely any of the extra navigational equipment, and absolutely anything that's not bolted down, extra seats, any of that kind of stuff. And they're going to strip it completely off the plane. They go so far as to actually, not only do they take off the armor, they actually take out the machine guns that are set on these planes to defend themselves in case they get attacked. Now, they don't want to look totally defenseless, so they remove the machine guns, and then they use broom handles that they paint to make look like machine guns, and put those out the window. So it's just window dressing. They're not actually useful. But anyway, he's able to strip these planes down essentially to nothing, and they're able to practice their takeoff. And these pilots get so good at it that they set a record of getting a B-52 to take off in 287 feet, which is absolutely amazing. And so once he proves that he can get a B-52 to take off in that shorter distance, all of a sudden now this plan to attack Tokyo becomes more realistic. But then there's logistical problems. It's, he's going to have the launch far enough away from the aircraft carriers are going to have to stay far enough away from Japan that they're not going to be caught by the defensive network that Japan has set off. And so they try to figure out what that distance is, and they quickly start to realize that even when they strip down all the weight out of these B-52s, and they put in only essentially a token amount of bombs, because again, they're keeping the weight down. This isn't about actually hurting Japan. It's just about showing the world that America has the capability to strike back. So even after they strip all that stuff out, there's not going to be enough fuel for a return flight. So they're not going to be able to get back to the aircraft carriers to land. And so they come up with this plan to launch off the aircraft carriers, to fly to Japan. Once they get to Japan, they're going to drop their bombs, and then they're going to hang a hard left into China. And so the problem with that is that, parts of China are controlled by China, which are our allies, Shanghai Shek and his government. The other part of China, though, the parts of China that are closest to Japan are actually controlled by the Japanese. Remember, the Japanese had invaded Manchuria, and they're expanding into China. And so what they realize is that they're going to have about enough fuel to get into the Chinese portion of China to try and land safely there. And then the Chinese government can help return our pilots and our equipment back to the United States. Now, they do recognize that even to do that, they're probably going to run out of fuel before they get to China. And so the idea is, just once they run out of gas, they're going to just coast into to China and then be able to land. And so it's this incredibly complicated thing where everything has to go perfect for it to work out. And these pilots are incredibly brave to do this. Well, they end up successfully pulling it off, but not without some hitches. As they go to start this raid, a couple of things are going to happen that are going to, cause some hiccups. The first thing is they actually get spotted. And so as the aircraft carriers are moving closer to Japan, and remember, the Pacific destroyers. So normally when an aircraft carrier is going anywhere, it's surrounded by destroyers to protect it. Aircraft carriers don't have a lot of firepower to defend themselves. They rely on other ships to do that. And those ships have been destroyed because of Pearl Harbor. And so these aircraft carriers are going with relatively little defense. And so they know that if they get spotted, this could be disastrous. And so as they're going, they get spotted by some Japanese merchant ships, fishing ships, and whatnot. And when they get spotted, the crew realizes that they're going to have to launch this attack early, right? That's scary because, again, they don't have the fuel to even get to China as it is. And the pilots decide, instead of calling off the mission, they call off the mission. They decide to go ahead anyway. And so, they launch, they're able to, get over Japan. They drop some bombs in the heart of Tokyo. It's really a symbolic attack. We're not able to destroy any significant kind of industrial might or military targets within Japan. But, the Doolittle and his men take, lots of PR photographs. You can see in the picture on the PowerPoint here that, or I should say the Google slide here, that, he's pinning medals to him. They write messages on the bombs. All that is just for domestic consumption to make Americans feel like, yes, we're fine. We're doing something. We're attacking back. And so we drop the bombs. And then the pilots head towards China. Now, here's where the next big kind of hiccup happens, is that when they're planning all this stuff out, they're actually kind of pretty rushed, as a matter of fact. And so the plans, they're not paying attention to detail probably as much as they should. And these makeshift runways that they're trying to make for these guys to land, they're not ready yet. They're not ready because the planners forgot to take into account time zones. And so they actually think the attack is coming the next day, not the day that it's actually happening. And so they're not going to be prepared for these. And so a lot of these, B-52s are going to have to make emergency controlled crash landings. They're not all going to make it. As a matter of fact, 10 planes strike Tokyo. We're going to see that, multiple planes go, only 10 will end up striking Tokyo. 11 so the remaining planes are going to head to China. We're going to see that 11 pilots are going to be forced to bail out. 4 total planes crash land. 1 actually lands in Russia. That's really unfortunate because even though they're allies of ours, the Russians aren't going to trust these pilots, and they're going to end up in a Russian gulag. We'll talk about the gulags more in the Cold War lectures, but that's no place that you want to be. The 8 pilots will actually be caught by the Japanese when they bail out. They'll land in the Japanese section. Japanese prisoners of war have it real bad, so not a place that you want to go. But overall, the raid is deemed a success in the United States. It's a huge PR campaign. It makes Americans feel good about the war effort. So it did serve its purpose as far as that goes. The Japanese don't call it the Doolittle raid. They call it actually the Do Nothing raid. And they say this didn't really do anything. Both of those assessments are, in fact, actually wrong. It's not an American success, and the raid didn't actually do nothing. What it did do, and this goes against what the United States and their allies would have hoped, is it actually exposes Japan's weakness to air attacks. And so the Japanese realize after Doolittle's raid that they need to do something to protect their homeland, that they are vulnerable. They didn't think they were this vulnerable initially. And so they didn't think aircraft carriers can do what aircraft carriers just did. And so they realized they need to create a ring of defenses around the homeland of Japan. And so they need to gobble up all those islands. They have to have, air like airports actually on those islands, air bases on those islands, and create this like ring of radar and air bases that can protect the homeland of Japan. And that's what they essentially go out and do while America is focusing on Europe. And that's going to make island hopping necessary later on in the war in the Pacific. And island hopping will be ultimately incredibly deadly. So even though we get this successful PR out of the Doolittle raid, we actually kind of strengthened our enemy's defense by successfully bombing Tokyo, right? We didn't really hurt Japan at all, but we did expose a weakness that the Japanese learn and then will, correct for later, which is, going to be devastating in the cost of American lives, particularly the Marines. The Marines are going to bear the brunt of that. So now, after Doolittle's raid is over, we're going to start to focus on helping out our allies in Europe. And so FDR's got another decision to make. He's already decided that he wants to help out the allies in Europe. And so he's going to do that. Well, at this point, you have two different views about what should be happening in Europe. There's Joseph Stalin's view, and Stalin in the Soviet Union says, open a second front in mainland Europe right now. And he needs that very particularly because he's bearing the brunt of fighting the German troops. And so all the best German equipment and soldiers are in the Eastern Front fighting Joseph Stalin. So this is the time of the battles of Leningrad and Stalingrad that we talked about in previous lectures. And so the Russians, they're holding their own, but at extreme cost. Right. And so Stalin knows that if America and Great Britain invade France, mainland Europe, that is such a threat to the Germans that the Germans will have to split their Eastern forces into two, leaving half for the Soviets to fight, and the other half are going to have to be rushed to France to fight off the Americans and the British. And so that is great for the Soviet Union because that means the people that they're fighting are going to be reduced by half, and the equipment that is being shipped out to the Germans will be reduced by half. And so the way Stalin figures it is if he gets a second front in Europe, all the fighting that he does from that point forward will be against half the number of Germans. And so that is super important for him. Now, Winston Churchill from Great Britain, however, is much more cautious. Remember, Great Britain is still in the fight because they were able to survive the Battle of Britain. But they're so depleted that they're in no position to invade France. They just can't do it, not without America's help. And so they're kind of hanging on to their own island, but they're not doing anything to liberate mainland Europe. And so now that America's in this thing, right, and America's sending supplies to Great Britain and they're sending soldiers to Great Britain, we're in a situation now where it is possible, at least, to invade mainland Europe. But Churchill will warn against that. He says we're not ready, that American troops haven't been trained enough, and we haven't gotten enough supplies into Great Britain to make Great Britain and America strong enough for a cross-channel invasion into France. It is very difficult to attack from Great Britain into France, crossing the English Channel, right? So it's a part of the ocean there, and because that's so difficult, what Churchill says is that if we try and end up failing, the Germans will kill so many of our soldiers that it might be, years or decades before we're prepared to try it again. And so if we try it and fail because we tried it too early, it could mean the end for everybody. And FDR will agree with Churchill over Stalin. Now, Stalin will take that as a plot of the capitalist democracies against the Soviet Union. What Stalin thinks is, if you're not going to open up a second front, it's because you don't care if a bunch of fascists fight a bunch of communists and they all just kill each other, because when the war's over, he thinks the capitalist democracies will just come in and kind of conquer everybody and whatnot. And so there's no real evidence of that as an actual plot. I can tell you that Winston Churchill kind of knows that and kind of is like, sure, right? Even though it's not an actual effort to, to backstab Stalin, Churchill's not totally against it. He hates fascists and he hates communists. Matter of fact, he doesn't see much of a difference between the two, because there's really not much of a difference between the two. And so he's kind of okay with that. FDR, on the other hand, I think it's an abundance of caution that makes him side with Winston Churchill. And so now they've got to figure out, well, what's another way to go about trying to liberate Europe? And so it's essentially the southern route. And so the southern route is much less well defended. So northern Africa has been conquered by Italy. So the idea is, well, Italy is not nearly as strong as Germany. And the Italian military is weaker in Africa than it is in Italy. So let's attack the weaker enemy in the weakest spot possible, and then slowly work our way across Africa, and then jump from Africa to Sicily, and from Sicily to Italy. And then we can essentially, once we get into Italy, we just go north until we run into the southern part of Germany. And so the second front that we are actually going to open will be in Africa, because we kind of view it to be the easier way. And so the Italian troops in the 1940s had started to conquer northern Africa. They attacked the British territories there in 1940, so Italy controls that area. They very specifically took that area over for two reasons. One, it's the oil in that area. There is oil. The Italians wanted northern Africa initially. We have rewound in time a little bit here. They wanted that area initially because oil reserves and access to the oil-bearing countries pretty much in the Middle East. And because if you cut off at northern Africa, and so from Egypt all the way to Morocco, you're cutting off you're essentially building a southern shield wall between Great Britain and its colonial empire. And so you'll be able to slow down the amount of resources coming from British colonies into Great Britain. And so Italy conquered all of that, essentially all of that stuff. The British still have troops fighting there, right? So after Operation Barbarossa, right? So after the Germans have invaded the Soviet Union, that's when Churchill and FDR decide to attack Africa. And they really do believe that this is what's best for eventually conquering Europe. And they believe that it's also providing a second front to relieve some pressure off of the Soviet Union. And that will be true, because by the end of the African campaign, it's going to be the invasion of Italy that's going to happen at the same time as the Battle of Kursk in the Eastern Front. And so from the previous lecture, we know that Kursk was the great big tank battle that was the last major German offensive in the Soviet Union. And the Soviets won that in large part because the Germans had to send some of their troops and some of their material to Africa for this campaign. So we start the campaign in Africa to relieve pressure for the Soviet Union. That is because that campaign is going to be so successful against the Italians. 6 months after we land in Morocco, the Germans are going to have to start to send troops down into northern Africa to help Italy keep control of that area. So, who do they send? Who does Germany send? Germany is going to send, it was probably their greatest general, is going to be Erwin Rommel. Rommel gets the nickname the Desert Fox. He shows up into Africa with the DAK, right? The German Africa Corps. And the German Africa Corps is just going to start to demolish the British soldiers fighting in Africa. Rommel is a strategic genius. He's a risk taker. He understands tanks in a way that just no other kind of British soldier does. As a matter of fact, Churchill is going to be going through generals like crazy in Africa, trying to find somebody to match Erwin Rommel's genius. He's never really going to get one. He'll settle on Montgomery later. Montgomery's not much of a genius. He just, is going to be one of the guys that is able to wear down Rommel. Nobody really ever outsmarts him. But anyway, the Erwin Rommel is going to show some massive success. He's going to take back a bunch of territory that the British had retaken, and is going to be, very successful in all of that. The British are, just going to be outmatched here, and a lot of times they're being outmatched by a smaller force, a less well-equipped force, and a force that's really not getting a whole lot of reinforcements. Rommel's going to be essentially, keeping his tanks running, although his tanks are superior to a lot of the tanks that the British and later the Americans are going to use. But he's holding them together with duct tape and, elbow grease, essentially. And so we're going to see Rommel will end up having a whole bunch of success. The tide will start to turn when a couple of things happen. One is when the British settle on, Bernard Montgomery taking over their force. Montgomery, again, is no match intellectually for Erwin Rommel, but he's got an ego, and so that ego is essentially going to help him to continue to have the guts to go toe-to-toe with a guy that everybody else is essentially afraid of. And so, Montgomery, even though he's not like the most strategic general out there, there is something to be said about just being willing to take the fight to your enemy. I mean, you can. I'd hate to compare the guy to Ulysses S. Grant because Grant is such a great military general, but Grant never outsmarted Lee. Lee was always the superior general. Grant just knew that he, as long as he kept bringing the fight to him, Lee couldn't match him. And so Montgomery will have I think a similar kind of approach. Now, Operation Torch, the actual invasion of North Africa is referred to as Operation Torch. And so the idea is that the American forces are going to invade in Morocco at Casablanca, right? We, as Americans, decide that we want to attack at Casablanca and start to push towards the east to eventually, get to conquer northern Africa and then jump up to Sicily and then Italy. We choose Morocco because it's being controlled by the Vichy French. Remember, that is the sympathetic French government. Morocco's been controlled by the French for a very long time. And so the Vichy French control it now. The idea is that the Vichy French will probably show much less resistance to an American invasion than any areas controlled by the Italians or outright controlled by the Germans. And that guess pays off. Now, it's Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, that's going to be placed in charge of this invasion. And, Eisenhower later is going to get called out about kind of the sneaky moves he made to invade Morocco. And, essentially what he did was he called up the Vichy French, made back channel contacts and essentially said, look, we're going to invade. And if you don't tip off the Germans and you kind of slow that whole response time down for the Germans and the Italians, if you kind of ignore that and help us out, Eisenhower essentially told the Vichy that they could stay in charge of the area, and they agree. People later will say that he, essentially made a peace treaty with Nazi sympathizers. Did he actually do that? Well, technically, no, it's not a peace treaty. But did he negotiate with and keep Nazi sympathizers in power? Sure, but he would make the argument, and it's a totally legitimate argument, that he did that in order to defeat a larger enemy, which is the Nazis. And war is hell, and you can't always just make the most moral decisions. Sometimes you have to make the tough decisions, and this was the decision that he made. The British are going to invade in Iran and Algiers, and then everybody kind of meets together and pushes east. So that's the plan. So Eisenhower's in charge, and Eisenhower and Montgomery will start to put the screws to Erwin Rommel. When that happens, Rommel's, there's going to be some back and forth. We don't have time to discuss that in much detail. Erwin Rommel is, going to put up a much stronger resistance than people kind of thought, but he's not going to necessarily be prepared for the amount of men and material that America and Great Britain are dumping into Africa. And so it's essentially, just a matter of time until the Germans and the Italians are going to lose here. And then eventually Rommel will get pulled away to help build the Atlantic Wall in Europe to start to create a defensive system to protect mainland Europe from cross-channel invasion into France or mainland Europe in general, not just France, because they're not sure that the invasion is going to be France. So when Rommel gets pulled out, that's going to be a death knell for Northern Africa. And so American troops will come to shore during Operation Torch. They'll fight very bravely, and eventually will be able to defeat Rommel. And so by May of 43, the Germans and the Italians are going to have to pull out. Rommel's forces just weren't being reinforced enough. He didn't have enough tanks. He didn't have enough fuel. And so, he strung together a defense as well as he could, but eventually was defeated, was overrun. Stalin, even though we've opened a second front, he's not happy about the Africa campaign because Africa's just not important enough to Adolf Hitler to pull off enough resources off of the Eastern Front to relieve pressure on Stalin. And so Stalin is, I'm sure is thinking, well, this is better than nothing, but barely better than nothing, and increases the calls for a cross-channel invasion. And he's putting real serious pressure on both the Americans and the British for a real invasion of mainland Europe, and an invasion in France, which is much more scary to the Germans than an invasion of Italy. And we can talk about that, why that is later. But large part of it is because of the Alps, the northern part of Italy, that really kind of protect Germany. So. Right. He's upset because the torch was just too conservative. It didn't pull off enough forces. He wanted that mainland invasion of Europe. So what are the results of the campaign in Africa? Well, the Germans and Italians suffer about 600,000 casualties, right? That's pretty significant. Remember, their populations don't support as large of militaries as America and the Soviet Union do. So, any of their losses are going to hurt more than American losses and Soviet losses. The British lose about 220,000 men. The Americans lose about 18,500 in Tunisia alone. There was some real serious fighting in Tunisia because Tunisia can be used as a jumping off point to get to Italy. And so there's some pretty tough fighting there, right? So the Allies will neutralize almost 1 million troops from the Axis powers, from Germany, Italy. And so, that 900,000 troops is a devastating loss to the Axis powers, and is softening up the Axis powers for an invasion of mainland Europe. The other thing that's happening that's really important here is by the time we take North Africa, and the time that once we take North Africa and we have bases in North Africa, all of a sudden now the German Luftwaffe is really going to have to protect from air attacks coming from Africa. And so the Luftwaffe is getting significantly worn down. That's super important because we've got to wear down the Luftwaffe before we can invade mainland Europe. And so North Africa is not just, gaining territory for the Allies. It's also wearing down the Germans and Italians, the number of soldiers they have. But even more important than that, it's the loss of tanks and airplanes and pilots that are really devastating to the Axis powers, because they're not going to be able to build those fast enough to protect from a European invasion. So we had the second front. It is successful. It is just not big enough. Right. And Italy is going to be next. So that is where we're going to leave off for the day. We'll pick up with part 2 of America Enters the War tomorrow. Thank you very much for your time.